Greetings, I am Dr. Avery Kinley, and I'm happy to present Module 5 for New Teacher Induction, which focuses on progress monitoring, assessing student needs. This module was created by Dr. Sean Antonetti and myself, Dr. Avery Kinley again, and I will be presenting this module, which focuses again on progress monitoring. And so as we begin, please make sure that you have joined the Google Classroom so that you can access all of the materials. And the module will begin now. So here are our learning targets. And our learning targets are to define the purpose of progress monitoring and curriculum-based measurement, to conduct curriculum-based measurement in mathematics and reading, to identify various types of progress monitoring, curriculum-based measurements, and probes, and finally, to utilize probes in instructional planning. And so those are the outcomes of this particular module, to focus on utilizing and understanding progress monitoring as well as curriculum-based measurement as we develop probes for instructional planning. So I have a question for you. If you could take a second to look at this particular graph, and based on the graph, is this student making progress? And then how do you know? So I'll give you a minute to think about that as you look at the graph. And here are the two prompts again, or two questions. Based on the graph, is the student making progress? How do you know? And so as you look at the graph, you may, see some peaks and some valleys, but you do see that it's steadily increasing over time, and you may conclude that, well, it is possible that that student is making progress, and that is somewhat of the uh, basis for which we utilize in order to make high stakes decisions, in order to instructionally plan. Looking at data. And so why do we progress monitor? Well, we don't know ahead of time whether or not an intervention will be successful for an individual student. And we can translate that into our own lives. We don't know ahead of time whether or not we will be successful if we try a new diet, or we don't know ahead of time whether or not we will be successful in teaching a new subject. Sometimes that happens after we go through the actual process. And so we don't know ahead of time whether or not an intervention will be successful for an individual student. And the only way teachers and schools can identify students that demonstrate proficiency or deficits is to continually assess and monitor students as part of classroom instruction. So again, that's very important that we continually assess and monitor progress. We must know on a day-to-day basis where our students are in relation to the content standards to have the necessary information to inform instruction. And if we are to ever know how we're doing, we will need to monitor progress to know where students are at any given point in time. And so why do we have to monitor frequently? Well, to change what you're doing with a student, if it's not working, we have to formatively assess. So when we're formatively assessing, we're assessing along the way. That helps us know whether or not we're being effective and efficient with our time and instruction. We also monitor progress frequently to help make decisions about instructional goals, materials, levels, and groups. This allows us to aid as we communicate with stakeholders, especially communicating with parents. Many times we often wonder, how do we communicate effectively whether or not a student is struggling to parents? And I always say, let the data speak. But that data can't speak if we don't monitor progress frequently. And finally, we monitor progress frequently to document progress for special education students as required for periodic and annual reviews, and as a part of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and if a student has an individual education plan, an IEP. So when we look at year-end assessments, We know that year assessments allow us and they provide an indication of the overall progress of a student in reaching a whole host of standards in a given year. But we understand that because those results are received many times well after the information has been taught, teachers don't have enough remaining time to try alternative approaches if they find that those students don't do well. And so we have to monitor progress frequently throughout the year. Year-end assessments are primarily designed to estimate a growth in knowledge and skills from year to year, to identify academically at-risk students, to evaluate students' progress against national norms, and finally, year-end achievement tests are often called summative assessments because they measure what has happened over a given period of time and measure in some instances, finality. Now, summative assessments, we just mentioned summative assessments, but summative assessments come at the very end. And so we have a whole host of summative assessments that could be conducted. So we have our Georgia Milestones Assessment, GMAS. Again, that's conducted usually at the end of a calendar school year. We used to have a graduation test. We have Lexiles, which cover an extended period of time. And then we can think about our traditional SAT and ACT assessment results, because again, those are covering knowledge learned from years of instruction and learning. And so summative assessments should not be used for progress monitoring. That's the most important thing, because again, they come at the end of learning. We can't make adjustments if the instruction comes at the very end, or if we're trying to adjust and we're at the end. So it's important that we understand and we note that for summative assessments, we do not utilize them for progress monitoring. So we talk about this word progress monitoring, and that simply is ongoing data collection. It's important because it allows us to assess student success. It allows us to estimate student rates of improvement, to identify students who are not demonstrating adequate progress, to evaluate the effectiveness of instruction so that teachers can create better instructional programs. And we utilize all of this to alter instructional variables to better meet the needs of individual students. So assessment types, we talked about summative assessments, and we hit on formative assessments a little bit, but just remember that formative assessments are ongoing. They occur throughout instruction, and it allows us to make changes as needed as we're progress monitoring. Summative assessments are administered to measure learning outcomes. Remember, summative assessments come at the very end. All right. Progress monitoring. So there are two types of progress monitoring that we could have. Mastery measurement, that's a form of classroom assessment conducted on a regular basis. And then curriculum-based measurement. So that's where we're looking at how a student performs in relation to the actual curriculum. And it's a form of assessment that is conducted on a regular basis. So again, remember, we have mastery measurement. That's conducted on a regular basis to determine the instructional sequence for the year. But then we also have curriculum-based measurements, where we look at the skills and instructional curriculum as assessed by a particular test or probe, again, across a particular year. Progress monitoring in both mastery and curriculum-based measurement. The skills assessed should be aligned with the curriculum. That's very important. Student skills should be assessed frequently. The assessment results assist in instructional planning. So all of these are pillars of effective progress monitoring using both mastery and curriculum-based measurement. So I want you to take a second and just look at this as we discuss mastery measurement probes. All right, so this is a mastery measurement probe. Again, notice that it is something that we're assessing over time. And in this particular case, it's assessing computation. And so the students in this case are tested weekly on their skills. So if you can think about it, if they're tested weekly, it does give us some feedback on whether or not any instructional strategies or any accommodations are working. It also lets us to know whether or not or when a student will achieve mastery. As we look at curriculum-based measurements, again, it's a form of classroom assessment that teachers can use to evaluate not only students' progress, but also the effectiveness of their current instructional methods. Curriculum-based measurement is an assessment procedure that is easily and quickly implemented, and the results provide a clear visual representation of how students are progressing academically. Additionally, unlike mastery measurements, curriculum-based measurements allow teachers to track student progress on all skills within a subject across the academic year. Now, there are some benefits to curriculum-based measurement. Some of the benefits are the ability to track students in various areas such as reading, math, spelling. It also allows us to be able to graph those assessment results. Another benefit of curriculum-based measurements, it allows us to determine whether students are learning from the current instruction by examining the graphs and comparing their scores to the expected performance. It changes the documented instructional strategies for students who do not show academic growth. And finally, it effectively communicates academic performance to students, parents, and other school professionals. Now, if we look at curriculum-based measurements in math, there are two different types. We can look at computation as well as concepts and applications. So thinking about the reasoning, mathematical reasoning. If you were to give a curriculum-based measurement in math, when you administer that, you would give the student the math sheet and pencil, and then you would repeat this information. And I want you to take a second and just read the instructions that you will repeat if you were administering a curriculum-based measurement in math. Now, as you look at that, notice that the instructions are very important because the instructions help guide us as we are administering this particular assessment. And if this is something that we're doing ongoing, then we want to make sure that the instructions are similar so we get similar results and we can say there's some type of reliability for the assessment that we're administering. If we look at curriculum-based measurement in reading, we can look at reading fluency. We could also look at a reading maze. It tests a global behavior that simultaneously requires many skills taught in the annual curriculum. So we can think that how important reading is to every other discipline. So if we're administering a curriculum-based measurement in reading, this is how we would do it. These would be the steps. We would give the student a passage to read. Place the teacher's copy out of sight of the student so the student cannot access that. And then, much like when we were administering a curriculum-based measurement in math, we would give the instructions, which are outlined in step 3. So I want to give you a second to read the instructions and to see what differences there are. Not many differences as the instructions that we would give in math, but in step 4, notice that in this case, we would set a digital timer for 1 minute, and that would allow us to track the progress of that student in a set identified period of time. So this is just an example of a computational curriculum-based measurement. And then if we look at what are the 6 steps, so this is very important. What are the 6 steps if we're going to administer a curriculum-based measurement? So here are the steps. Step 1, We create or select the appropriate tests. Very important. Tests need to be selected appropriately based on grade level and ability level. Step 2, we administer and score the probes. Step 3, so now that we've administered and we've scored those probes, and we have to graph that information. That allows us to get a visual representation of how that student is performing over time. Step 4, we now set goals, and those goals will be used to make instructional decisions. And once we have made those instructional decisions, then we have to adequately communicate progress. So those are the 6 steps that make up the process for administering a curriculum-based measurement. Notice that at the bottom, curriculum-based measurement is conducted on a regular basis. Again, very important. Usually once a week, and all skills in the instructional curriculum are assessed by each test and or probe across the given year. So here's an outline along with some videos that just kind of outline the steps in that curriculum-based measurement process. All right, so as you see, and I wanted to give you a second to read that, one of the most important things is that probes are administered with the same directions each time. That helps us ensure that we have some form of reliability. All right, remember step 3, we want to graph those scores. Here's an example of where we graph those scores. And this is the part that many teachers have difficulty with in the fact that, yes, we do have to assess progress over an extended period of time. All right. So step 4, we set goals. It's critical to indicate the expected level of proficiency that students should demonstrate. Step 5, remember we talked about, we want to make instructional decisions. So when we're making those instructional
standardized decision rules developed by Lynn and Doug Fuchs, decisions should be made by observing the students' 4 most recent scores. If the scores are above the goal line, the end of the year goal should be increased. If the scores are below the goal line, the instruction should be revised. And if the goal line and progress are pretty equal, no changes should be made. Here are 2 examples. These 2 students are responding to the same instruction very differently. If you look at Louise's graph at the top, you see that her last 4 scores have been below the goal line. This indicates that it's time to do something new with Louise's instruction. Looking at the lower graph belonging to Luke, you can see that this is working very well for him. So well that his last 4 scores are above the goal line, indicating that Ms. Begay should set his end-of-year goal higher. Ms. Begay has been using the standard workbook that came with the spelling curriculum. Even though Luke is improving with the workbook, Ms. Begay will have to consider other strategies that will supplement Louise's instruction. Ms. Begay will know if these new strategies are having an effect by comparing Louise's progress with her goal line.
All right, so that time they were able to explain and review each one of the graphs. And again, the goal line is very important because it allows us to make the appropriate instructional decisions. All right, step 6. This is where we communicate progress.
After all of this information is gathered, Ms. Begay shares it with students, parents, and other professionals. Studies have shown that students like seeing their progress, are more aware of their progress, and even feel more responsible for their own learning when provided with CBM information. Parents who received CBM data reported better communication with teachers. Using CBM data also facilitates the decision-making process when educators and professionals collaborate.
All right, so that's step 6. So where do you find probes? This just gives you a list of some probes and where they may be attained. AimsWeb is one computer software that will graph and analyze the scores for you. We utilize AimsWeb a lot within the district. Also, you have Dibbles. And so you can see all of the links to each one of these. If you're asked to create probes, this is kind of a go-to area for you to find some probes that can be utilized to assess student progress. And so finally, I want to thank everyone again for the opportunity to present this information to you about progress monitoring with Module 5. There is an assessment that has to be completed that will review some of the information in this module. And as always, you can go back and review the information contained in the video and take your time as you go through the module. So I do appreciate you again. I'm Dr. Avery Kinley. This is Module 5, Progress Monitoring, Assessing Student Needs. Thank you.